On the coldest night of the year, my wife and her family locked me out of our own home during a raging snowstorm. They stood at the window laughing, and her father shouted, "Freeze to death, worthless idiot." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just turned and walked away into the blizzard. 3 days later, my inbox was overflowing with 47 desperate messages from the very same people who had mocked me. Please stay with me as I tell you my story. And if it moves you even a fraction of what I went through, share it with someone who believes loyalty still means something. It was the middle of December, the coldest week of the year. That day was our 7th wedding anniversary, and I wanted to make it special. I finished work early, stopped by the bakery to get her favorite dessert, and picked up a small velvet box with a necklace I'd been saving for. On my way home, the snowstorm grew heavier. The wind stung my face, but my heart was warm thinking of how surprised Melissa would be. When I reached our driveway, I could see the glow from the living room. I smiled, picturing her greeting me at the door. But as I stepped closer, I saw something that froze me in place. Melissa and her parents sitting together, laughing. I tried the door. Locked. I knocked, thinking maybe it was some mistake. Melissa came to the window with a smirk, sipping hot chocolate. Her father appeared behind her, grinning, and shouted through the glass, "Go freeze out there, worthless idiot." Her mother laughed until she had to hold onto the wall. I stood there, flowers in one hand, dessert in the other, my breath fogging up the glass. "What are you doing?" "It's freezing," I called, but Melissa only shook her head and turned away. The cold bit into my skin. I don't know how long I stood there before something inside me simply shut off. Without a word, I walked away into the storm. Snow clung to my eyelashes as I trudged down the dark road. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. Hours later, I found myself at a small roadside motel. The elderly owner didn't ask questions, just gave me a warm cup of tea and a room. For 3 days, I didn't check my phone. I didn't want to hear from them. But on the 3rd morning, I finally turned it on, and the screen lit up with 47 unread messages. Some from Melissa, some from her family. They were no longer laughing. What they said next made my stomach twist. And I realized this wasn't just cruelty. It was something much, much worse. The wind bit into my skin, sharp and unrelenting, pushing against me with every step. My jacket was too thin for this kind of weather, and the snow was piling so quickly it reached past my ankle. My legs burned from the effort of moving forward, but stopping wasn't an option. The cold was alive, creeping into my bones, weighing down my chest. Somewhere in the distance, through the blur of white, I caught the faint flicker of a sign. It was weak, some letters missing, but it was the first sign of shelter I had seen. The building it clung to was squat and worn, its windows frosted over, a layer of snow clinging to the roof like an extra blanket. I pushed the door open, and warmth rushed out to meet me, almost painful after the hours outside. The smell of something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon, drifted through the small lobby. Behind the counter sat a woman with neat white hair, her glasses perched low on her nose as she studied a crossword. She glanced up, her eyes locking on me for just a beat longer than casual politeness required. "You look frozen through," she said, her voice steady but touched with quiet concern. Without waiting for a reply, she disappeared into the back and returned with a chipped mug full of steaming tea. "Drink this first." The heat seeped into my palms as I wrapped my hands around it. I could feel my shoulders drop slightly for the first time all night. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make me explain why I was there, why my clothes were dusted in snow, why my face must have looked like I'd been walking for months. I paid for a room, took the key, and made my way down a short hallway to a small space lit by a single lamp. The heater rattled softly I peeled off my wet jacket, draped it over the back of the lone chair, and sat on the bed. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender. Sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept circling the same moment, the same voices. I tried to untangle what had happened, to find some thread of logic, but it was like reaching into fog. Every time I thought I had an answer, it slipped away. Morning came quietly, the storm outside replaced by a stillness so complete it made the world feel pause. The motel owner knocked once, leaving a small tray with toast, scrambled eggs, and a slice of orange. I ate slowly, staring out at the untouched snow beyond the glass. The 2nd day passed in silence. I kept to my room, letting the hours slip by without trying to fill them. The world outside seemed far away, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. I didn't turn on my phone. I wasn't ready to invite that world back in. By the 3rd morning, the quiet had grown heavy. I sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the phone resting on the nightstand. My hand hovered over it more than once before finally pressing the button. The screen came to life instantly, and in the space of a breath, the calm of the past 2 days fractured. The messages started appearing one after another, spilling onto the screen faster than I could read. Whatever I had been expecting, it wasn't this. The phone felt heavier than it should have, the light from the screen stabbing at my eyes after so long in the quiet dim of the motel room. The notifications kept coming, one after another, piling on top of each other until the whole screen was nothing but alerts. My thumb hesitated before opening them. The first message was short. Please come home. The next was longer, frantic. We made a mistake. You don't understand, Michael. Just talk to us. Then another. This isn't what you think. We need to explain. They came from Melissa, from her mother, even from her brother, who never texted me unless it was for something trivial. Every one of them had the same strange mix of desperation and guilt, like they were trying to pull me back before something else happened. I scrolled further, the messages stacking into an unreadable blur, until one stopped me cold. The police are looking for you. You need to explain yourself. My stomach tightened. The words seemed to echo in the small room, louder than the hum of the heater. I read it again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change. But it didn't. I opened my email next. The subject lines there were worse, full of accusations and demands. People I barely knew were sending me angry notes, calling me heartless, a coward, even dangerous. I didn't understand how any of them knew what had happened. Then I made the mistake of checking a local news page. It was there, in black and white, a story about a man who had abandoned his wife during a deadly winter storm. The piece didn't name me outright, but it didn't need to. The details were too close to my own life to be coincident. The photo they'd used wasn't mine, but the comments underneath were filled with people connecting the dots, some even tagging my name. And in those comments, the story had already grown teeth. People claimed I had been violent, that I'd stormed out during a fight, slamming doors and cursing, that I had left a poor woman alone to freeze. Not one word about how I'd been the one locked outside. It was a lie, built so carefully it almost looked like the truth. And there was only one person who could have fed it to them in such detail, Melissa. I set the phone down on the bedspread, staring at it as if it might confess something. My hands were trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the slow burn of anger rising through me. She hadn't just humiliated me that night. She was trying to erase what really happened and replace it with her own version. One where I was the monster and she was the victim. One that could destroy my name long after the snow had melted. I didn't know what her endgame was yet, but I knew this much. She hadn't expected me to still be out here, watching from the edges. And if she thought I'd stay silent, she was wrong. The call came late in the evening, long after the sun had dropped and the motel hallway had gone quiet. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but something in me said to pick it up. Michael, it's James. Don't say my name out loud. Just listen. His voice was low, urgent, nothing like the relaxed tone I was used to hearing from. I hadn't seen James in weeks, maybe months, but he'd been one of the few people I trusted without question. Hearing him speak like this made my chest tighten. You can't go back there, he said, pausing as if making sure no one could overhear him. I'm serious. You're being set up. The words landed like a punch. I sat forward on the bed, gripping the phone tighter. Set up for what? What are you talking about? I've seen things, he continued. Things I didn't want to believe at first. But now, after what you told me happened, he trailed off, then took a slow breath. 2 weeks ago, I saw Melissa. She wasn't alone. The air in the room seemed to thin. Who was she with? A guy named Carter. You know him, works with her. He's not just some coworker. The way they were looking at each other, it wasn't work. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Carter. I remembered him from a couple of work events Melissa had dragged me to. He was slick, the kind of man who laughed a little too loudly at his own jokes. I'd never liked him, though Melissa had always brushed it off. They were at this little place downtown, James went on. Not somewhere you'd take a client. They were close. And I'm not talking friendly close. I'm talking about the kind of close you don't mistake. I pressed a hand against my forehead, willing my thoughts to line up, but they wouldn't. You're telling me she's been seeing him? I'm telling you that night she planned. The one you thought was for your anniversary. It wasn't for you, James said, his voice hardening. Carter was there. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but after what they did to you outside your own house, I couldn't keep my mouth shut anymore. The walls of the motel room seemed to close in. I could see it so clearly now, the smug look on Melissa's face through the window, the laughter that had cut through the storm. It hadn't been some random outburst. It had been calculated. They wanted you to leave, Mike, James said quietly. That whole stunt. It was to make sure you walked away so she could say you abandoned her. Makes it a clean win for her in court, and she gets to play the poor, neglected wife. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles ached. Why are you telling me this now? Because once this thing hits the legal system, it's over. She's not just lying to the people around you. She's building a case. And trust me, she's got help. Help. I didn't need to ask from who. Melissa's family had been in on that night. Every laugh, every mocking word, it had been part of the plan. I sat there long after the call ended, the dial tone buzzing in my ear before I even realized James had hung up. My mind was spinning, but the shock was quickly burning away, replaced by something hotter, sharper. I'd been humiliated, lied about, and set up to take a fall I didn't deserve. But now I had something I hadn't before, the truth. And I wasn't going to waste it. I didn't rush. That was the first choice I made after James's call. Every instinct in me wanted to storm back into that house and demand answers, but anger without proof was useless. If Melissa was willing to lie that far, I needed something stronger than my word against her. I needed to see the whole board, every piece she'd set in place. The first step was the bank. I still had access to our joint account, though I suspected she'd forgotten that in her haste to cut me out of everything else. It didn't take long to see the changes. Large withdrawals, some in cash, others disguised as purchases from stores she'd never shopped at before. The total drained over the last month was more than I wanted to believe. I printed every statement, slipping them into a folder I bought from the drugstore down the road. That folder became my anchor. Every day I added something new. James helped with the next piece. He'd gone quiet after our call, but a few days later he sent me a string of photos. Melissa and Carter. Sometimes they were together at that downtown place James had mentioned. Other times they were at his car, leaning close, hands brushing in ways that left no doubt. He even caught one shot of them at a hotel parking lot, her hair messy in a way that made me feel sick. I didn't reply to the photos. There wasn't anything to say. But proof of an affair wasn't enough to explain why her family had been so quick to play along. That answer came in the form of overheard words at a coffee shop. I'd gone there because I knew Melissa went often, usually with her mother. I didn't expect to see them that day, but there they were at a corner table, leaning in close like they were conspiring, which, as it turned out, they were. I kept my head down, hat pulled low, and waited. He's been so distant for months, her mother was saying. Emotional neglect, that's what you call it. It'll hold up if you stick to it. Melissa stirred her drink slowly. He'll look like the one who walked out. I just have to keep my story straight. The urge to walk over and blow their cover was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to stay still. I let them talk, catching snippets about financial separation and splitting assets before he can touch them. By the time they left, I had enough in my head to write out word for word. That night, I sat in my motel room and did exactly every detail, every phrase. It all went into the folder. The final piece came from digging deeper into Carter. He wasn't just some coworker flirting in the shadows. He was a client, a wealthy one. That explained the sudden confidence in Melissa's voice when she talked to her friends, the expensive clothes she'd been buying, the way she'd started carrying herself. She wasn't planning to run off with some fling. She was trading me in for an upgrade, and she'd built her plan to leave me stripped of everything by the time she made the move. I stared at the folder that night, thicker now than I'd expected it to be. Inside it was the truth, or at least enough of it to turn her perfect little plan inside out. But I didn't rush. Not yet. Let her keep thinking she'd won. Let her walk around with that smug smile, certain she'd buried me under her lies. The longer she thought the game was over, the more careless she'd become. And when the time came, I wanted her to see exactly how wrong she'd been. I knew the next move had to be clean, silent, and invisible. If Melissa thought she could predict my every step, I wanted to make sure the next one she couldn't see coming. I handed in my resignation at work without a reason, just a polite thank you for the years I'd been there. My boss looked surprised, maybe even concerned, but I kept my tone calm, my face unreadable. There was no point in explaining something I didn't want getting back to her. From there, I visited the bank, not the joint account, but my personal one, the one I'd always kept separate for emergencies. I emptied it in cash, every last cent, and walked out without looking back. That money was no longer safe in a place she could reach. The cabin came next. It belonged to an old friend who had moved out of state years ago. It sat high in the mountains, surrounded by pines, the kind of place where the air felt heavier from the silence. No neighbors, no curious eyes, no uninvited guests. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine for as long as I needed it. From there, I watched things shift. At first, Melissa's messages tried to imitate remorse. I didn't mean for it to go that far. We should talk. This is a misunderstanding. Then they soured. You're making this worse. We need to settle things. Sign the papers and stop dragging this out. Important papers. I didn't need to guess what they were. Meanwhile, the whispers started. People I'd known for years began treating me differently. Conversations cut short when I walked by. The local hardware store clerk avoiding eye contact. It didn't take long to hear why. Melissa's family had been busy. They weren't just telling people I'd left her. They were telling them I was unstable, prone to episodes, even dangerous. It would have been easy to storm back and confront her, to demand she stop poisoning my name. But that was exactly what she'd expect. Instead, I started keeping records. Every rumor traced back to someone. Every shift in her tone saved in neat little folders. Every lie cataloged with a date and time. My lawyer, a quiet, sharp-eyed man recommended by James, was the only one who saw the full picture. I'd meet him in small cafes or out-of-the-way diners, sliding evidence across the table without a word. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't need to. The way he looked at the file told me enough. This wasn't just a defense anymore. It was preparation. Up in that cabin, the nights were cold and the roads were dark, but I finally had something I hadn't felt since the storm: control. Melissa could keep spinning her stories, her family could keep fanning the flames, but none of it mattered. Because for the first time since this started, the game was mine to play. Winter had settled into the town in full force, the kind of cold that turned every breath into a puff of white and coated the streets with a thin glaze of ice. I'd been patient, waiting, letting Melissa's version of events run unchecked while I worked in the background. Every lie she told, every calculated move, was another thread I was weaving into a net she couldn't escape. That's when I heard about the gala. It came through a contact of my lawyer, a charity winter event organized by Melissa's office. The guest list was long, glittering with local names, donors, and business owners. And there, right in the promotional photos, was Melissa, smiling beside Carter like they'd been partners for years. The caption described them as the event's lead sponsors. My lawyer's raised eyebrow was all I needed to see. We both knew this was it. Public, formal, carefully staged to boost their reputations, which meant the fallout would be just as public when things shifted. The night of the gala, the streets glittered under fresh snow. I arrived at the venue, a historic hall lit by crystal chandeliers, in a tailored black suit that felt like armor. My lawyer walked beside me, briefcase in hand, and our private investigator followed close behind, his small recorder tucked safely into his pocket. The three of us stepped into the warm, perfumed air of the ballroom, the low hum of music and conversation washing over us. The crowd was polished, men in tuxedos, women in sweeping dresses, champagne flutes catching the light. And in the center of it all was Melissa. Her hair swept up, her dress a deep wine red. She was every bit the picture of elegance. On her neck hung the necklace I'd once hidden in my desk drawer, waiting for the perfect anniversary. She'd re-gifted it, claiming it as something from Carter. She didn't notice me right away. I stayed near the edges, letting her work the room. She laughed, shook hands, leaned in close to Carter in that way she thought looked intimate, but not suspicious. The guests seemed charmed. They had no idea. Eventually, she stepped up to the podium at the front of the hall. The room quieted. Her voice filled the space, smooth and confident, thanking everyone for attending, for supporting the community cause they'd chosen for the winter season. That's when the investigator moved. Calmly, deliberately, he walked to the sound booth and handed the technician a small device. The man looked confused but pressed play when my lawyer nodded. The audio began faintly at first, just enough for Melissa to pause mid-sentence. Then it grew clear. Her voice. Laughing. And he just stood there in the snow. I told them, this is perfect. He'll walk away, and I'll have everything I need for the settlement. Gasps rippled through the audience. Heads turned. A few people stepped back from her, the distance between them suddenly noticeable. Melissa froze, the color draining from her face as the recording continued, each word sharper than the last. Beside me, my lawyer's expression never changed. The investigator crossed his arms, watching the room's temperature shift from warm admiration to cold disbelief. When the clip ended, the silence was heavier than any storm I'd walked through. All eyes were on her, and for the first time since this began, Melissa looked small. The room didn't recover after the recording ended. Conversations didn't resume. The music didn't swell back in. People just stared, some at Melissa, some at Carter, some at each other, silently piecing together the truth from the scraps they'd just heard. Carter was the first to move. At first, it was just a shift of his jaw, the tightening of his grip on the champagne flute. Then he set it down, a little too hard, the glass ringing against the table. His eyes stayed on Melissa the whole time, cold and searching. "You told me," he started, but stopped when he saw the people nearest to them leaning in, hungry for whatever came next. He stepped closer to her instead, voice low but sharp. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way Melissa's shoulders stiffen. Whatever he said, it didn't end in forgiveness. He turned, cutting a path through the crowd, ignoring the murmured questions from those who tried to stop him. The doors opened, a rush of cold air spilling in, and then he was gone. Melissa was alone in the middle of the ballroom now, and the shift in the crowd was immediate. Her parents had been near the front, faces tight with forced composure during her speech, but now they looked afraid. Her father's hand gripped her mother's arm, and they exchanged a glance that was less about comforting her and more about calculating what this meant for them. They didn't step toward her. They stepped back. My lawyer was already moving, pulling a thick envelope from his briefcase. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The moment he stopped in front of her, she looked at him as if he'd just spoken a language she didn't understand. He handed the envelope to her, his voice even, carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "Mrs. Lane, you've been served." She stared at the envelope but didn't take it right away. When she finally did, her fingers trembled, the weight of it sinking in before she even opened it. Inside were the divorce papers, yes, but also the full list of demands. Damages for slander, restitution for the funds she'd taken, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was all legal ink on heavy paper, but in that moment, it might as well have been a verdict. Melissa's eyes darted through the crowd until they found me. She started forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Her lips parted, but whatever words she had lined up, I wasn't interested in hearing them. I turned before she could close the distance. The air near the exit was cool compared to the heat of the ballroom, and each step away from her felt cleaner, lighter. Somewhere behind me, I could hear the faint rise of voices, hers, her family's, the crowd still murmuring over what they'd witnessed. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. The papers moved through the system slowly, the way legal matters always do, but time worked in my favor. Each week that passed, the edges of the scandal dug deeper into Melissa's life. I didn't have to push it. By the time the final hearing came around, she wasn't the same polished woman I'd seen on the gala stage. She arrived late, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, her hair pulled back too tightly as if neatness could hide the strain. She didn't meet my eyes when she walked past me. Inside the courtroom, my lawyer handled everything with quiet precision. He laid out the evidence like pieces of a puzzle, the financial records, the statements from witnesses, the audio recording. Each item was presented without heat, without drama, and yet each landed with the weight of something undeniable. Melissa's attorney tried to frame it as misunderstandings, but even his tone lacked conviction. The judge's ruling was clear. The house was mine. Most of our shared assets, what was left of them, were transferred to me. She would be responsible for certain debts she'd taken on alone, and there would be no spousal support. When it was over, I stepped outside into the late spring air. It smelled faintly of rain, the sidewalks still damp from a passing shower. Melissa emerged a few minutes later, alone. Her parents weren't there. Neither was Carter. She glanced in my direction, but I was already walking toward my car. Over the following months, I rebuilt quietly. The house took time to feel like mine again. I repainted the living room, cleared out every trace of her, the framed photos, the pieces of decor her mother had insisted on. The silence inside felt different now, not heavy but open. I didn't talk about what had happened unless I had to. People in town already knew enough, and those who didn't would hear their version eventually. I didn't care which version they believed. The truth had already done its work without me shouting it from rooftops. From what I heard, Melissa moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. The debts caught up with her faster than she'd expected. Jobs came and went. Friends kept their distance. Even her family, the same people who had laughed behind the glass that night, were nowhere to be seen. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not exactly. There was no triumph, no grand sense of victory. Just closure. The storm that had started with a locked door and cruel laughter was over, and the cold they'd left me in had finally broken. I didn't need to see her again. I didn't need another word from her. Some things, I learned, fall apart without your help. It was late, the kind of quiet where even the clock seemed hesitant to tick, when my phone lit up on the table. Her name. For a moment, I just watched it vibrate, the sound sharp in the stillness. I could have let it ring out, but curiosity, or maybe habit, made me answer. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "You were the best thing I ever had," she said, the words rushed, almost breaking. A pause. Then softer. "I'm sorry." There was nothing else. No explanations. No pleading. Just those two sentences hanging between us. I didn't answer. I let the silence grow until she ended the call herself. Outside, snow was falling again, slow and steady, the kind that covered everything in a clean, unbroken sheet. I sat back in my chair, the warmth of the fire soaking into me, the phone resting quietly beside the mug of coffee I hadn't touched in minutes. The storm was still out there somewhere, but not here. Not anymore. And for the first time in a long time, I had no urge to step back into it.